Good afternoon, guys. Happy Wednesday. We're halfway through the week. I want to hear, go ahead and put your hands above your head and raise the roof. We're almost there, guys. So, we are going to pick up right where we left off. So, last lecture, we talked about Bush domestic, remember? We talked about the kind of the stagnant economy. I think unemployment was at its peak during his administration was about 7%. Globalization was happening. A lot of companies were moving out of the United States into um, other areas of the world. So, for example, I know that car manufacturers were moving most of their plants and their manufacturing to places like China and Japan. Right? It's cheaper to pay people. It's easier to produce some of the products, and so we start to see that affect the U.S. economy. We also talked about the L.A. race riots. We talked about Rodney King and the racial tension in the United States during the early 1990s. Um, but today we are going to move away from domestic discussions, and we're going to actually cast our focus on Bush's foreign policy. So let's take a look at the do now. Number one says, what was the Iran Contra affair? So we talked about this during the Reagan. We talked about this during the Reagan lecture. So if you need a quick refresher, go back, open up that lecture, and you can find the Iran Contra affair. Okay. Number two, what is the significance of Marines in Lebanon? So we talked about U.S. forces going into the capital of Lebanon, Beirut. Why were we there, and what happens when those U.S. Marines are there? And number three, write whether you agree or disagree and explain why. You should do what you want to do, even if your parents tell you it's wrong or bad. Of course, you guys are going to say that sometimes you should not do what you're supposed to do, what you want. And the reason you're going to say that is because you always listen to your parents, don't you? 100% of the time. You guys are like the perfect children. Okay, I'm being a little sarcastic. There's obviously not a right answer, but please make sure you give me a full, complete sentence, okay? The learning objective today. We're going to describe and evaluate through sequencing H.W. Bush's foreign policy. Plain and simple. This is Bush's 1988 election. You can see that he won almost 80% of the electoral vote, and he won just over half of the popular vote. Um, Remember, popular vote is the it's basically counting every single vote, and that's how you select a president. But we don't have that system. We have a electoral vote here in the United States, and so there's a big there is a big debate over the validity of the electoral college and whether or not we should continue using it. But that is another topic for another day. There is the man. There he is. 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. So he's in office from 1989 to 1993. Foreign policy. We have used this word more times than I can even count in our class. Foreign policy is basically a term that is used to describe relations between two independent countries, right? Foreign policy. So, once again, we are talking about the Panama Canal. It's been a million years since we discussed this. The beginning of the school year, we talked about the Panama Canal. Uh, which president, if you can think back, which president was involved with the construction of the Panama Canal? Think about that for a second, because we talked about this. He's kind of a larger than life figure. He's got a big mustache. He helps create national parks in the United States. Which president am I talking about? And of course, it is Teddy Roosevelt, right? Um, so the next question is, why in the world would Teddy, this guy who's president of the United States, why in the world would we go down to Panama and build this canal in Panama? Well, it's really a great question, and it's pretty genius why they decide to use Panama as the point of entry, or the kind of this great project here in Central America. So Let's look at the northern Atlantic here. Let's look at the city of New York. There's two routes here, two paths. One of them goes all the way around from North Atlantic to Southern Atlantic to the tip of Chile down here to Southern Pacific, back up to the Northern Pacific. This route right here is 13,000 miles. That is a ridiculous length, right? 13,000 miles. But if you look at same beginning, right? Same destination. But if you go this way through the Panama Canal, it's only 5,200 miles, right? So why in the world would we build a canal here? Well, the reason is because we want to cut travel time from the Atlantic to the Pacific, right? So any destination in the Atlantic to the Pacific or the Pacific to Atlantic, we want to cut this huge length of travel around South America. So if we look at this global map, it's not just the United States that uses the Panama Canal. Every country in the world, global trade relies on having access to the Panama Canal. It cuts off thousands and thousands and thousands of miles that you would otherwise have to take using the route around South America. So it's vitally important to the global economy for global trade. It's important for the movement of products. So this is a really, really, really important country, and the Panama Canal is it's a hub for trade. Now, we've talked about the actual. Well, we haven't really talked about a lot of the geography, but we've talked about one of the most important landmarks in Panama. But let's talk about the government itself. So let's go ahead and open our work here, the document, the Google document. First section says the invasion of Panama. So let's read this. It says President George H.W. Bush took steps against Panamanian dictator and drug dealer Manuel Noriega. He sent U.S. forces to Panama where they restored democratically elected leaders. Noriega was captured and taken back to the United States where he was tried and convicted on drug charges. Now you're thinking, holy cow, this is the leader of Panama. What in the world is the United States talking about? We invaded Panama, captured him, tried him on drug charges, and then convicted him. We went from him being a world leader to, or the leader of Panama, to being a convicted drug trafficker. And we are going to connect the dots in the middle there. So I want you to quickly watch this video. It should say Noriega. It's the clip that says Noriega. It's in your Google Classroom. So I'm going to give you a moment to watch that. Go ahead and pause it. Okay. So we're going to move forward here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background behind Noriega. This is grossly oversimplified, okay? There's a lot more details, and it's not as simple as the information that I'm presenting, but this is a very brief summary of Noriega. Noriega grew up in a very poor family in Panama. When he's turns into a young adult, he joins a military academy in Lima, Peru. Comes back to Panama, joins the Panamanian military, and basically is involved with a coup in the 70s. A coup d'etat. Coup d'etat is when the military overthrows a government. Okay. Once that happens, Noriega becomes a really high-ranking member in the new Panamanian government until that leader dies, and then Noriega basically takes over. Over the course of his military career, Noriega is seen as an ally to the United States. He gives the American government a lot of intelligence information. He talks about rebel groups in South America that the U.S. is after. He provides guns and ammunition. So the United States, gives Panama guns and ammunition so that they can give those guns and ammunitions to rebel organizations that the U.S. supports. And he's also a huge ally in the war on drugs as well. So Noriega is responsible for giving intelligence against drug cartels. He helps capture drug bosses. So he's seen as a very big ally. However, there's a dark secret with Manuel Noriega. And that dark secret is that even though he's helping the United States and he's working with the U.S. and he's helping stop drug trafficking, he himself, the leader of Panama, is a drug trafficker. And he basically uses his position and power as the leader of the country to grow very, very rich off of the illegal drug trade. And so he is smuggling drugs into the United States. He's smuggling drugs into Europe and other places around the world. And so the question I'm sure you have now is, why in the world would the U.S. allow this? Well, the U.S. allowed it because he gave such good information to the United States and helped the U.S. in their drug war to such a degree that the U.S. was willing to basically close its eyes and let Noriega continue his drug trade. So that is the story of Manuel Noriega and his power over Panama. We are actually going to. No, please make sure that you answer the questions here. What was he arrested for? Is number one. How many troops did he use to invade Panama? That's in the video. How does this impact President Bush's legacy? So, the United States, a sovereign country, right? An independent country invades another sovereign country, an independent nation. What does that say about America's power? And also, what does that say? What does that say about our status in the world? And also our national interest, right? Why in the world would we invade another country? What were the reasons that we talked about? How is Panama a strategic location? So I'm going to go back to this picture right here, right? So we talked about why Panama, the country itself, is so important, not just to the United States, but other countries around the world. Why is it such a strategic location? Okay. And then we are going to actually, now that we've finished Panama, answer those questions real quick. We are going to move our focus and attention to, again, the Middle East, right? So we talked about Lebanon during the Do Now. The Lebanese leader asked the Americans to send over troops so they can help stop a civil war going on in Lebanon. However, when our troops are sent, we station them in Beirut and they are attacked by a car bomb. It's the first act of terrorism towards U.S. troops on foreign soil. Okay? So, we're actually not going to be talking about Lebanon. We're going to shift our focus to the country of Iraq, right? Iraq is, you could say it's kind of centrally located in the Middle East. It shares a border with Iran and Syria and Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and then more importantly, today our focus is going to be on Iran and Kuwait. Okay, Iran itself, the country is located in between a few countries. Geographically speaking, there's a mountainous region in the north and kind of the northeast of the country. There's some fertile land in Iraq itself, and then in the west you see more desert, right? Now, if you look at the very bottom here, one interesting thing is that Iraq has access to the sea, but it's a very, very small area of land. And then if you look south, Kuwait has much more access to the sea. And that'll come into the reason we point that out will become obvious here in a second. The interesting thing about the Middle East in general is that a lot of the Middle East is actually carved up and drawn out by Allied powers after World War I. So even after World War I, World War II, there's some changes. But generally speaking, the Middle East is carved up after World War I, and so it's carved up by the French and British. An important resource that's found throughout the Middle East, and more importantly, found in Iraq, is oil, right? There are several countries in the Middle East whose economies rely heavily on the exporting of oil, right? And at this time, one of those countries is Iraq. So if you look to its southern border near Kuwait, you see a massive amount of oil and gas reserves here in the south. Historically speaking, Iraq felt entitled to Kuwait, but because of alliances during World War One, Kuwait is given its independence, or a slice of land is carved out and named Kuwait. And so um, after after years of after years of being neighbors with Kuwait, Saddam Hussein, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, he comes to the realization that it's time for Iraq to absorb Kuwait, invade it, and take over. Um, People don't just do this out of the blue. Usually there's reasons why you would do something like this. The reason that and again, this is oversimplified. There's a lot of different reasons, but I would say probably the most important reasons are because, um, historically speaking, Saddam thinks that Kuwait should be a part of Iraq. During the 1980s, when Iraq and Iran were at war, Kuwait loaned lots of money to Iraq. And so if Saddam invades Kuwait, he doesn't have to pay back those loans. Additionally, Kuwait produces a lot of oil as well. And so having access to more oil is going to help the Iraqi economy. And not just that, but it would give Iraq ample access to the Persian Gulf, which is right here. And it would give them easier access to international waters. So again, those are not all the reasons, but that's a gross simplification. So what ends up happening is, in 1990, Saddam invades Kuwait. The United States tells Saddam to leave, however, he does not. So what ends up happening is there's a coalition of American forces, along with, I think, around 30 countries from the United Nations, that decide to go to war with Saddam. And so you see militaries from all over the world working together to stop Saddam and to kick him out of Kuwait. So um, there are bombing campaigns that happen in Iraq. Iraq also is firing missiles on Israel at this point. And eventually, Saddam cannot withstand basically the world's military, the military of the UN, and so he eventually gives up. He leaves Kuwait, and he retreats back into Iraq. However, in order for the United States and the other nations to stop their campaign against Saddam, he has to promise to not invade Kuwait again. He also states that he recognizes Kuwait as a sovereign nation. And he has to pay back damages that he has caused to the state of Kuwait. The interesting thing is that when Saddam leaves Kuwait, in order to damage the Kuwaiti economy and to damage U.S. interest in Kuwait, right, he sets fire to oil fields in Kuwait. So while he's leaving, he sets fire to all of these Kuwaiti oil fields, and it causes massive damage to the Kuwaiti economy, and in return, he was trying to damage America's oil supply as well. So he's damaging U.S. interest. So after this happens, Americans are celebrating, right? And this is the first Gulf War. There's two of them. Another one will happen during the Bush Jr.'s presidency, but that comes later down the road. So this is the first Persian Gulf War. So make sure you read the section. It says, when Saddam Hussein refused to withdraw from Kuwait, UN forces under U.S. leadership launched Operation Desert Storm against Iraq. That only lasted a few days, and Hussein agreed to remove all Iraqi troops from Kuwait and pay Kuwait for damages. The United States became involved in the Persian Gulf War in 1991 because the U.S. saw the invasion of Kuwait as a threat to its national interest. This term, national interest, I've used it several times during this lecture, and it will probably reappear again when we talk about foreign policy. We talk about interest, right? We talk about, for example, when we talk about your interest, things that are important to you, right? It's the same thing with nations. Nations are not people, obviously, but in some ways, nations kind of act like people when they interact with one another. Um, the U.S. has its own interest, right? Whether that's making sure that it's got enough oil from its partners in the Middle East, or whether that's removing Noriega from power in Panama in order to stop to help put a dent in the war on drugs and drug trades. Um, the U.S. has a lot of national interest, and so the invasion of Kuwait and stopping it was an interest to the United States. It was a national interest. So it says the United States wanted to create stability in the Middle East by maintaining peace and stopping oppression. Question number one says, why did Saddam Hussein blow up the Kuwaiti oil fields? It's stated right there in the video. So if you didn't get it, make sure you watch that video again. Describe the image of the explosions on the first video with 3 adjectives, right? Um, I want you to see the destructive power of this military campaign. So please give me 3 adjectives. And then why were relations between the U.S. and Iraq strained, and how had the U.S. helped Iraq previously? So the first portion of this question, why were relations between the U.S. and Iraq strained? Think about it in terms of the Cold War, right? During the Cold War, we talked about 2 major superpowers, 2 ideologies, 2 economic systems, right? We talked about the U.S. We talked about the Soviets, right? We talked about capitalism versus communism. So in that video, it states what was Saddam's relationship, or in what way did he partner himself in the Cold War? Who did he support? And the second part says, how had the U.S. helped Iraq previously? Remember, I mentioned that Iran and Iraq were involved in a long, protracted war during the 1980s. How did the U.S. help Iraq during that war? And number 4, how did the Persian Gulf War end? So, what eventually happens to Saddam? And what's the result of that? And then there are, if you go further down, it's that same image from earlier in the lecture. How had the United States been previously involved with Panamanian affairs? If you look at that picture right there, it gives you a really good indication of what was so important about Panama. Number 2, what would be a positive impact of the Panamanian invasion? So think about Noriega. What was Noriega doing? And what eventually does the United States do, right? And why did we do that? Number 3, do you believe H.W. Bush did the right thing? So do you think it was the right thing for the Bush to invade Panama and remove Noriega from power? Yes or no, and give me a reason. Don't just give me a yes or no, all right? I need full sentences as well, please. And then below that is a passage on the Gulf War. Please make sure that you take note of the political cartoon down below. Both of those are going to be vital, and it's going to be super important for you to look at both of those in order to answer those questions, okay? So as always, if you need help, if you're stuck, if you want me to clarify, I know I moved through this video super quick. So if you need more clarification on something, if you're confused on a question, please reach out to me, okay? I'm available, and I'm not just willing to help, but I want to help you guys. So please use me as a resource, okay? Other than that, guys, we are finished. I know this was super quick. Your heads might be spinning because of the speed of this lecture, but at any point during this time, please pause the videos, rewatch them, go back to certain sections if you're stuck or you need help. Other than that, guys, have a fantastic Wednesday. Enjoy the rest of your week. I appreciate everybody working so hard. I know that you guys will continue, and I hope that you guys have a great, safe week, okay? So enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you guys on Monday.